Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our second plenary panel at River Rally 2024. It's great to see all of you here today. I'm April Engel, and I am the Advocacy Director at River Network. And I'm going to start off with just a few announcements. So first off, let's give a big thank you to all the campus staff who are providing tech support, food, and for all their hospitality this week. We also want to give a big thank you to all of our sponsors who are making River Rally possible. And as we did yesterday, we have an ASL interpreter in the front of the room, and we invite anyone who would like to sit near towards the front to best see them to we have several tables right up here in the front, and you're welcome to move forward. A few other announcements. A reminder that the field trips are leaving at 2 p.m., and if you're not going on a trip, we encourage you to check out the Blue Art Collective out here in the hallway for some art making. They have a really great participatory art project going on. Another reminder for this evening, we are having another outdoor event at the park just a little ways down down the river. And when you come tonight, remember to bring three things: your ID, your pint comp from the other night for the party at the Blue Bridge, and also the food tickets that were in your badge when you received your badge at registration to the park for the party tonight. And also for tomorrow morning, we are going to have a bag check available in room 201. So when you check out of your lodging tomorrow morning, you're welcome to bring your luggage with you here and put it in room 201 to store until you're ready to depart from River Rally tomorrow. And I think with that is all of our announcements. And to begin this afternoon's plenary session, we're excited to share a message from Brenda Mallory, who is the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, that was recorded for all of us who are attending River Rally and very relevant to this session's focus on policy from the ground up. So we're going to hear that video, and then I'm going to be introducing our panelists. So we'll watch the video, and then I'll be right back to introduce our panel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the team at River Network for all of your work leading to this year's River Rally, and for all your efforts to protect our nation's water resources. This country is home to many treasured and irreplaceable freshwater resources, including our rivers, wetlands, and estuaries from coast to coast. For all of you gathered on the banks of Michigan's mighty Grand River this week, you do not have to look far to understand how water truly is the lifeblood of our communities and families. This is why, since day one, President Biden has been advancing the most ambitious water agenda in history, which is an essential feature of his climate change, conservation, and environmental justice agenda. His first week in office, the president established the America the Beautiful initiative, our country's first national conservation goal, committing to conserve, protect, and restore at least 30% of our nation's lands and waters by 2030. So far, the president has protected or restored protections to more than 41 million acres of lands and waters, including some of our nation's most treasured places: the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, Bristol Bay and Tongass National Forests in Alaska, the Everglades in Florida. President Biden is also the first president to use the power of his office to prioritize the restoration of wild salmon and steelhead in the Columbia River Basin in true partnership with tribes and states. We also supported a landmark agreement that will help secure the sustainability of the Colorado River. And during Earth Week, we took a decisive and clear step forward through the announcement of new, bold national goals to restore, reconnect, and conserve 8 million acres of wetlands, and 100,000 miles of rivers by 2030. We also launched the America the Beautiful Freshwater Challenge, joining with tribal nations, states, territories, cities, land trusts, mitigation banks, private landowners, sportsmen and women, conservation organizations, and businesses committing to further our clean water efforts. We are protecting clean drinking water by taking historic actions to remove toxic contaminants like lead and so-called forever chemicals from our water supplies. This includes committing to remove 100% of our nation's lead service lines within a decade and finalizing the first standard to remove PFAS from our drinking water. And last month, the administration also announced an all-of-government approach to accelerate the delivery of drinking water and sanitation infrastructure to tribal communities that have lacked access to clean water for too long. President Biden believes that every person should have access to clean water. And we are taking bold actions across the country to improve clean water access for all. This is the Biden-Harris vision for clean water, working together in partnership with tribes and states, local governments, and the private sector to conserve, protect, and restore the nation's waters from source to tap for the benefit of communities and species that depend on them. And every person listening today is essential to realizing this vision. It takes all of us working across the local, state, tribal, and federal levels to deliver clean and ample water for both people and nature. And the work that you all are doing on the ground is important. I saw firsthand the importance of local leadership and partnerships last month when I was in Detroit, Michigan, where for too long communities have faced environmental injustices and been denied basic access to clean drinking water. In Detroit, I saw how local groups, such as We the People of Detroit, are playing a vital role in ensuring that every single person has access to clean water by forging partnerships and engaging in community research in order to deliver clean, affordable, and sustainable water supplies for the people of Detroit. Together, our actions today will help enable the collaboration essential to delivering clean water for all in this country. We are in a fight for clean water, but it's a fight we can win. More importantly, it's a fight we must win. So thank you all for your partnership in building a more sustainable and equitable future for all.
Chair Mallory for recording and sharing that message and teeing up this afternoon's panel, which I'm incredibly honored to introduce. So, as we all know, communities across this country and the world are more and more frequently impacted by climate change and increasingly experiencing problems like property damage and health problems and safety issues as a result of toxic pollution, flooding, and extreme heat. Inadequate wastewater treatment and lack of access to safe and affordable drinking water in many communities are compounding these threats. And community-based organizations, all of you in this network and beyond, are working with and within our communities to advocate for solutions to these problems to make our communities safer, healthier, and more resilient and more equitable. And we are mobilizing to hold decision makers accountable to address these issues. Today, we have the distinct pleasure to hear from 3 network advocates who are working alongside members of their communities to convince decision makers to address issues that they are experiencing and learn about the impactful strategies and approaches they are using so we can carry them home to our communities following River Rally. So I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Sarah Diringer, who is a program officer for Water and Climate at the Pisces Foundation, to kick us off. Thank you all so much for being here.
Found it. How's that? Ooh, good. Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy lunchtime. It's great to be here with you all. I'm Sarah Diringer, and I lead the climate and water programs at the Pisces Foundation. We're a private family foundation based in San Francisco and work nationally on issues relating to climate, to water, and to environmental education. Our water program in particular supports organizations that are advancing more equitable and holistic approaches to water policy, particularly in US cities. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to share the stage with these incredible leaders. I'll start with introducing Dennis briefly. Dennis Mabasa is the Vice President of Community and Youth at the Gate National Parks Conservancy and recently joining the San Francisco Bay Area. Dennis has spent their career building a diverse and inclusive environmental movement, and Dennis is also a recipient of this year's River Hero Award. Ayanna Jolivet Mccloud is the Executive Director of the Bayou City Waterkeeper in Houston, Texas, where she's an inspirational leader, artist, and advocate for Houston's precious wetlands, water, and people. And Jill Ryan is the Executive Director of Freshwater Future, a regional catalyst for community action in the Great Lakes, strengthening policies to safeguard our waters. And Freshwater Future is the inaugural River Hero Award winner as an organization. Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And I'm going to start with an opening question as a chance to kind of introduce yourself and to ground the panel for this conversation. And I'm wondering if you can each share, what does policy from the ground up mean to you? And how does that manifest within the work that you and your organization are doing? So Dennis, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dennis Mabasa. I use they, them pronouns. And I just have to say I am incredibly honored and humbled to be up here with Ayanna and Jill and Sarah. I'm really excited for today. A little bit more about myself. I was born in the Philippines. I'm from an island called Panay Island, a region called Calibo. And I moved to Los Angeles when I was a kid. A lot of my work was centered in Los Angeles, in and around the LA River. I grew up just a couple yards away from the LA River. And the work that I'm talking about today is from an organization called Friends of the LA River. I'm the former chief operating officer of FOLAR, or Friends of the LA River. I'm also a board member for a nonprofit called LA River State Park Partners. So my heart is deeply rooted in Los Angeles. And I'm curious, has anyone ever been to the LA River? Raise your hand. Yay, okay. Most people, when I talk about the LA River, people are like, LA has a river? But to answer your question, Sarah, policy from the ground up, what does it mean to me and the work that I do? So I see policy or government as one of the many systems of power that exist to dictate whether or not we have environmental justice or environmental injustice. Policy, for me, is really only one of those systems of power. The community members that I work with, the partners that I work with, the team that I work with, we look at these systems of power, we reflect on the systems of power, and what we try to do is leverage community-driven solutions to address these systems of power. Specifically with FOLAR, we look at power systems within housing, within higher education, within workforce, and land and water management. So those are sort of the systems of power that we've been reflecting on, and that's going to be a little bit of the work that I do. And then lastly, right now I'm in San Francisco. My current role is Vice President of the Gate National Parks Conservancy. We're the nonprofit partner of the Gate National Recreation Area. Really long name. But I just started 4 months ago. So once again, a lot of my work is going to be centered around Los Angeles and that work. But thank you all for listening to us, and I'm excited for today.
Thanks, Dennis. Ayanna, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Can you all hear me? There we go. Okay. Yeah, so happy to be here. Happy to see so much Houston representation in Texas. Yeah. I just wanted to do that one more time just to get a little props for Houston. My organization is Bayou City Waterkeeper. I'm the executive director. One thing that I want to sort of demystify, everyone always wonders, well, where they're, like, are you from New Orleans? And so Houston has a lot of bayous. And so we're known as the Bayou City. Now, New Orleans might actually disagree with me on that, but we claimed that name some time ago. It's just a reminder that we are a water city. And so water is our point of entry to so much in our city. In terms of Bayou City Waterkeeper, just to sort of remind folks of like who we are, how we work in a really unique sort of a way. We are known for our legal work. We do really bold legal work. We're not afraid to use litigation. We have historically leveraged the Clean Water Act to enforce change in our watershed. We also have a framework in recent years around community science, too. And so we use science, data to action frameworks to enforce change, to serve community, to look at data gaps for decision makers and for community. And more recently, we have an organizing framework as well. And so we have organizing staff. What policy from the ground up, what that means for me is policy can only be as effective as the community it serves. So to Dennis's point, we have to really listen to community. Historically, a lot of times we look at policy and we look at policymakers and lawyers around the table, and we think about that as being a place for power. For us, we see power in community, and we see that there's lived experience that we need to lean on, and there's different levels of expertise. We have to demystify what power means, and there's different sort of definitions around power. Also listening to the community, and I like to use the word rooting. So rooting our work in community. So often we have to go into these spaces around decision makers and talk about the laws that many of us don't know how to access. And so what if we sort of do that along with rooting the work in the community and lived experience? Many community members are the ones that are impacted, and they know what the solutions are. So how can we have those conversations and listen to community? Additionally, developing multiple points of entry for the community to enter into this work. The door is closed for so many people to access policy work. Sometimes that's we use a lot of jargon language, and we make a lot of assumptions. So how do we create points of entry for different communities to enter into the work? And then I guess the last thing, and I'll just sort of end on of sort of what policy from the groundwork is for me as a creative person coming into this work is that policy is actually a creative act. So we actually write policy. We imagine what community needs. Usually it's not with community at the table historically. So if we think about policy from the ground up as a space for creativity, imagination, and reflection, that policy is a creative act, that it is a space for a community to imagine what we want. And I say we because I'm from many of the communities that are impacted in our work, what we want for ourselves to fix all the things that have sort of happened to us and as overburdened, impacted communities, that it is the space for imagination and creativity that we will in the future step into, and that becomes the sort of framework in which we have to sort of work around. So I'll pause on that.
Thank you, Ayanna. And I'll pass the same question to you, Jill, on what does policy from the ground up mean to you?
Thank you. I'll also start with just a little bit more about myself and Freshwater Future. And so Freshwater Future has been serving communities for about 30 years. And I've been helping with that at Freshwater Future for about 25. To us, that really means listening deeply, participating with community, and ensuring that we're providing services. So we are not community ourselves. We are here to support and lift up voices of communities. We work with about 2,000 community organizations in the Great Lakes states and province. And we provide assistance, we provide funding, we provide consulting for nonprofit management, we provide policy help. But the way we can do that is by first creating deep relationships. None of this work can happen by us coming in to some place and having an answer. So we spend a lot of time with our community partners being present and really understanding what are the policy solutions that are needed. And policy from the ground up to me, and I think to Freshwater Future, is really about there is no solution without understanding what's the problem. And I think often when we're looking at federal policy or statewide policy, we have an idea about the tweak we want to make. And we don't necessarily listen to what is the real problem that's needing to be solved at the community level. And so that's what we really try to do, is speak with communities about what are the issues that most need to be solved and what are the details of solving those things. And then finally, for me, that question of what does this mean? It's also about holding space to get the actual result that's needed, rather than taking an incremental change that might not be appropriate for the community or that may do harm. So it's several things, but I really think we're seeing progress, but there's still quite a bit to be done on that last one. Making sure we can hold the space so we're getting the actual results that community really needs to see.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Jill. Yeah, something I'm hearing echoed from each of you is about access and space and power, and thinking about each of those and how they're interrelated and in community. And I'm wondering, Ayanna, particularly for your work, I'll start with you on thinking about environmental justice and how that sort of manifests within your work. And I'm wondering if you could share an example with us about how rooting and centering environmental justice has led to more effective policy in the work that you're doing.
Yeah. I'll share an example and say Bayou City Waterkeeper has actually been around for over 20 years. And it is kind of part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, which is a loose network of nonprofit organizations. Historically, we've been a water quality organization. We've used the Clean Water Act as the driver to enforce change. How we show up around environmental justice is a more recent thing in our work. And so I do want to sort of name that. We've always been a bold organization because we've used the law, and we're not afraid to to use the law to enforce change among our decision makers, among developers that are unlawfully building in wetlands. We've always been known for bold action. How we show up around environmental justice, I will say that Harvey was the catalyst in Houston to enforce change and for us to rethink justice. Because Harvey was the largest flood event in U.S. history, and we remember those images of the whole city and impacted by water and covered with water. And so it was already, the seeds were planted before I started. And so I've been at the organization for 3 years. The seeds were planted, and we were already sort of showing up around justice and talking about community. There's some key words, talking about resiliency and things like that. And we've been more overt around that work. For us, we're building a framework around water justice. And so I'm really happy to see water justice show up in our work. We have a water justice organizer. We are talking about sort of what water justice looks like. And we are also, I just sort of think about Dr. Bullard, who is based in Houston, the father of environmental justice. And just a reminder, I remember I went to an HBCU climate justice gathering a couple years ago, and it was a convening, it was a couple of hundred people, and one of the things that he reminded us is that environmental justice was a footnote, and now it's at the forefront now. We have policies around environmental justice, and that started off as organizing and grassroots organizing and a lot of resistance. Just pivoting real quick, I guess one concrete example of sort of how environmental justice shows up in our work. We recently, with West Street Recovery, who is here in the room, a partner that we work with closely in Northeast Action Collective in Houston, Bayou City Waterkeeper, partnered to launch a campaign around private sewer laterals. And basically, an example of sort of why this is environmental justice is that Bayou City Waterkeeper, through our past work, we have a consent decree in the city of Houston around sewage, a $2 billion consent decree. A consent decree is only as effective as it is enforceable, and so sometimes these things are not as successful as we think because they're long-term solutions. Communities of color were left out of that, and because I won't go into the details of why, but what we realized is that private sewer laterals, the infrastructure between a person's home and then the city's water infrastructure, that needed to be repaired. And we saw that that was happening in Blacker and browner communities and low wealth communities. So these were communities where they were having sewage coming up in their homes, underneath their homes, and inside of their homes, and they were living with this sewage. So this is an example of sort of how we showed up around this work. This means nothing to anyone if I tell you this unless we sort of show the impacts of how people are living with this. And how we showed up around this work is through working with West Street and the NAC and to do sort of community research and surveying to go to the community members' homes to assess how much they document that and see how much sewage is impacting community members. And then from there, we gathered that information, and then we launched a campaign. We had that in front of a community member's home with their permission and being very mindful of power dynamics. And we had a press conference and a tour of that. And then the same evening, we went to City Council to demand $20 million for private sewer laterals. So that's now, yes, let me get some props on that.
Right.
Because now we know it's always so much more work. But I think that's a really good concrete example around sewage, around injustices, and then how you do that from a values-oriented way driven by community members. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Ayanna. Dennis, I'll go to you next on a similar question, asking about how environmental justice has shown up in your work. And I think particularly you have a long history of working in communities and with youth, and I'm curious about how you think about the intersections of environmental justice and engaging with communities and with youth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess before I dive into the work, I'm just going to set the stage a little bit for the LA River. When I work with some of the communities in Los Angeles, a lot of folks often say, LA has a river. And it's a surprise to many people. And when I talk about it, a lot of folks are like, oh, from Grease or Terminator. There's those movie scenes where cars are driving in the river. And a lot of people think of concrete as synonymous with the river. They think it is a piece of infrastructure. They think it is a flood control channel and that we have no benefit to it. But really, as as a member of the LA River community, as the former COO of FOLAR, we recognize that the LA River is one of Los Angeles' strongest tools in climate resilience. It cleans our air, it cools our temperatures, and it provides the biodiversity essential to our collective well-being. But really, how did we get here? How did it become concretized? So just going back to history, the rivers in the Southeast are a little bit different than in other regions. So the LA River was an ephemeral river. Sometimes it flowed above ground and sometimes it flowed below ground. And the path of it would change all the time. It was really dynamic. And when you're trying to build a concrete city on top of that, it's hard to predict a moving river. So after a 100-year flood in the 30s, the Army Corps of Engineers paved the river. They put concrete all over all of it. They also saw the river as a dangerous thing. So where did they put it? They put it in some of Los Angeles' most vulnerable communities, low-income Black and brown communities. So they chose the path of the river to be someone else's problem. And when I say they, I mean folks that are not people of color, folks that didn't have that power. So really, from there, they also lined the banks of the river with really heavily polluting industries. So not only are the communities that live next to the river at risk for flooding, but they also are experiencing really high pollution burden. The community that we really center a lot of our work is in East LA, in Elysian Valley. There's a tool called the EnviroScreen mapping tool, and this specific community has a pollution burden of 100, which means that it is one of the most polluted regions of the entire state of California, which is a problem. You know, it's also a low-income Black and Brown community. So that, you know, that's another big problem. Where FOLAR entered, they started about 40 years ago. And when they started as an organization, a lot of their work focused around advocacy for restoring the river and building park spaces around that river. So that was about 40 years ago. And now today, the communities, what they're facing, they are facing not only the pollution burden, but now they're also facing the potential threat of displacement. The organization historically didn't necessarily integrate parks-related anti-displacement strategies into their work. They didn't think about inviting the community into these decisions as they were building new park spaces and restoring these parks. So now the community that lives there has experienced pollution for generations, and they're also experiencing the potential threat of displacement, of being pushed out. Which, gosh, like, that's a lot. That really is a lot. And really, I'm gonna talk about one of the projects. There's so much to talk about today, but I'm gonna talk about one of the projects that we're focusing on in terms of environmental justice. It's the development of a new park. So about a decade ago, a new park was acquired by California State Parks as a product of community advocacy. FOLAR was a piece of that, but as y'all know, advocacy is not just due to one organization. It's really a community-driven effort. So the park was built. It's not yet a park. And really my work right now, and the work that I did with FOLAR, is centered around making sure that the park is being developed in an equitable way to prevent displacement as much as possible. How do you build a park in an equitable way? I'm so glad you asked. There's a lot of things that you could do to make sure that that happens. And one of the tools that we're trying to figure out is how to implement what I call parks-related anti-displacement strategies, or PRADs. One of the many PRADs is workforce development. And a little story that I'm gonna tell. So we were looking at the land. So right now they're heavily polluted, super duper polluted. And the traditional methods of remediation of lands, it's a method that I call scoop and dump, which is a lot cuter than it actually is. It's pretty horrible. They scoop the polluted lands and then they dump it elsewhere. So it's someone else's problem. But, you know, like, that's how we got here. That's how we created these EJ problems. And I really didn't want that to be a method of remediating these lands, because then it will just literally be somebody else's problem. So we went to the drawing board to figure out, can we influence this? Can we change how these lands are being remediated? So we did a lot of thinking, and we looked to nature to figure out some of the solutions. And through that process, we met a team out of UC Riverside. They're a university nearby. We met two people, Dr. Sam Ying and Dr. Danielle Stevenson, of the biogeochemistry department. Really big name, but they work on soil. But what they do, some really cool stuff, they use plants and mushrooms to clean and heal lands. So they plant native plants and plant mushrooms into the soil, and that remediates the lands. You know, oyster mushrooms, for example, they eat dead trees. Fossil fuels, like diesel fuels that have been like poured into the lands, that's basically just dead tree juice. You know, so like oyster mushrooms are able to really pull up those toxins in a really, really effective way. But the DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substance Control, doesn't necessarily see phyto, myco, phytoplants, myco mushrooms, remediation as the most effective solution to addressing this problem. So we worked with students to give them opportunities to work with these researchers to figure out the efficacy, like how well are these plants and mushrooms pulling out the toxins of these soils. We worked with the researchers to give them an acre of the plot of land in the 100-acre section. And after a year of that work, paid work to the students, they were able to find out that it is just as effective as traditional methods of remediation, which, you know, is so exciting. And not only did they learn this for themselves, but at the end of the process, they invited community members, their teachers, their leaders, but also members of the DTSC, members of city council, members of the mayor's office to listen to them. High school students presenting to these adults about what they learned in this process. And you know, we haven't finished that process, and it's still an ongoing effort, but we're really recognizing this as a strong tool that can hopefully influence how we remediate our lands in Los Angeles and hopefully beyond. So that's like one of the pieces of environmental justice that we're doing. But there's so much, and I just want to, I guess, there's a lot of things that I'm going to say, but the work wouldn't happen if it weren't for the researchers out of UC Riverside, a teacher named Leo Reyes from the high school Sotomayor Arts and Sciences Magnet, an amazing individual, Mireya Valencia, the director of education, and Danette Buzenket, an educator. So I want to give a huge shout out to those individuals and the dozens of other individuals and community members that made projects like that happen in and around Los Angeles. But thank you.
Thanks, Dennis and Ayanna. I sort of forgot that I was moderating a panel, and I just
I got your mom.
just want to no.
Okay.
No, just that I could sit and listen to all of you for a while. Jill, I want to shift a little bit. Ayanna and Dennis have shared these really great examples of like on the ground change that's happening and like in the place that they're in. And I'm curious if we could expand and think about what does that mean at the state and the federal level. I think we often talk about how policy at the federal like kind of comes down to state and comes down to local, but I'm wondering if we can kind of flip that script and if you could talk a little bit about how these examples at a local level and policy and power at a local level then ladders up to state and federal.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, it's funny because we often hear about these things as disjointed. You know, oh, that's local policy, that impacts you as a local person. Well, of course, all federal and state policy gets implemented locally. So it all impacts local communities. That's the thing. So we often hear, well, people really don't want to get involved in that state and federal policy. That's not something they're interested in. Well, yes, they are. Of course they are. It all impacts them. We know that. I'm impacted. I know that. So that's something we really work with communities on to not only make sure that we're all understanding what the impacts are flowing from federal or state policy. So one of the things, as an example, in Pennsylvania, there's a relatively new law in Pennsylvania that basically entices private water companies to buy municipal water systems. It's a law that nobody paid much attention to as it was being introduced. Well, the result is local municipalities are being told a story about this gumball jar that they're going to get, where they can buy all these fun projects with the money they're going to get for their system, and that they won't have to pay anything for this. They're going to just get all this money. But the result that comes from that is the ratepayers are going to pay all of that to that private company. And so what we've seen is 200 and 300% increases in water rates because of these sales. Now that doesn't impact the State House, but that's where the policy happened. So that state policy has now trickled down to about 20 communities in Pennsylvania where their water prices have risen precipitously. And they had almost no say, even when they were participating. They would go to city council meetings, they would demand information, and many times were persuaded not to participate. So one of the things we do is really buoy up those groups. We have several groups now in Pennsylvania who their system is already sold. Their problem is there. They're working now to help every other city in Pennsylvania, right? And so they're going to their neighboring communities and telling them how to do the work, to get the information so they can participate in those city council meetings, so they can get the proper information in order to understand what's being proposed here. So I think that idea that communities aren't interested is completely false. They're very interested. But how do they get that information is really a big problem. And so that's one of the things we try to work with our communities on is how do we keep the information flowing from community and from our state houses and Congress so that people know what's happening. We wish that people would have seen this law coming in Pennsylvania, but things happen very quickly these days. If you're a corporation or a set of corporations, you probably are doing a lot of lobbying before these things get introduced. So we're making sure that people have a chance to go to Washington, D.C., to go to their state houses, not to lobby on our issues, to lobby on their issues, to be able to work with us to prepare to go to those kinds of visits and have their own time to speak about their own local issues. And then to bring that back to community. Give some money so that you can have community meetings to bring that information back and allow community trainings and that sort of thing. So we're really trying to think about, there is no policy that doesn't affect you locally. It's all local when it gets implemented. And so if we start with that premise and then begin to build our policy frameworks from there, because like someone else said, our policy is a tool. Policy is a tool. That's how I think of it. And if we can change that tool to be the better wrench for the thing we need to fix, that's what we need to do. So that's really how we're trying to work on some of these issues. And I just want to talk about one other thing in terms of kind of this environmental justice idea. We often, I think, forget that environmental justice isn't just out in the environment. Environmental injustices happen to people. And so we can forget that, you know, if you can't afford your water, that's an environmental injustice. Mm-hmm. If you can't get clean water, that's an environmental injustice. And so thinking about these things holistically, we have to also be willing to hear what does a community need beyond the issue that we work on. So it's not, we can't just go in and say, I'm working on water, and what are you interested in? Many communities that have issues with water are really also working on housing. How do we get affordable housing? How do we get job training? How do we get fresh food into the community? So being able to also pull back our own narrow focus to acknowledge those other issues and be willing to work on them. We may be asking for something in terms of the community thinking about how we're looking at water. We have to be able to do the same thing in the other way. So those are some of the ways that I think about environmental justice, and there are so many examples we could give, but I think that the Pennsylvania story is very prescient right now because there is a huge push to privatize our water, and not just by states. There's a report from a White House committee that says we should privatize all of our water. And so we have to all take these things seriously because even if municipal water isn't perfect, it's a lot cheaper. We've seen that. and we need water to be affordable. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Jill. I want to build on something that you just said and then pass this to Ayanna and Dennis. One of the things you were saying is, we kind of go into communities, especially for those of us who aren't from the communities we're working in, with kind of water top of mind, but people are facing multi-dimensional issues. And I'm curious for each of you how you think about when you're working with communities or with other organizations that have different priorities, and how you kind of bring that together, or how you use water as a way to enter into these conversations on other topics too. And Ayanna, can I go to you first?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I say in Houston is water is the point of entry for community transformation. So we usually, water is the thing that is the entry in which we do the work. We might start off because somebody has been flooded and they're still living with the impacts of flooding, or someone is dealing with sewage, or a wetland is being built and unlawfully being built in a neighborhood, and that's going to cause all kinds of impacts. But we have to look at compounded impacts around this. And that's how many organizations on the ground already work. So when you look at a lot of organizing frameworks, we talk about sort of the wholeness of our community. I think I want to shout out a couple of people, but Monica Lewis Patrick from We the People is a hero of mine, and then also Catherine Coleman Flowers too. Two Black women leaders that are, Monica Lewis Patrick is actually part of the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, which I'm a part of. And then Catherine Coleman Flowers is just doing interesting, amazing work that is around sanitation. Water can be the point of entry because that is the thing, but we have to, so many communities are dealing with cumulative compounded impacts of injustice. And so you go into a community, and so we have to talk about the issues around education, around incarceration, around health inequities as well. We can't do all the things. So the best way to sort of approach this is to think about new ways to think about collaborative partnerships. How do you bring in other organizations, housing organizations, a university? We've worked very strategically around working with universities to increase the capacity of community around data. We're limited in what we can do, especially in this moment with the demands on so many community-based organizations. We have to show up in this moment in new ways than we've had to show up before. It's exhausting. And so to be really thoughtful about partnerships and bringing in new partners that do that work really well is how we're thinking about that work. I think also one thing that we don't talk about is we have so much pressure around action to do the thing that sometimes we need to just have the space to sort of listen and to regenerate. Impacted communities that are dealing with so much injustices are exhausted. We're dying. We are dying prematurely. We have health impacts. We have depression. I mean, there's so much that comes from this work. Not to mention when you work deeply in community, that impacts you deeply in community. And so I think that the space for regeneration, and again, Monica Lewis Patrick at We the People, she was talking about water recreation. And so like thinking about the space for regeneration in this work, how do we reconnect ourselves to the water that we are actually advocating for? And I think that has been another piece in our work. One of our values is regeneration. So while the water is the point of entry, we so often look at water as the problem. We are afraid of the water, and that is very complex, especially for Blacker and Browner communities, because of so much injustice. But I think that thinking about the healing power of water, too, is also another way to approach this work, and to think about starting off with water and then coming back to water, but in a different sort of a way.
Thank you. And Dennis, I'll go to you with the same question around, if you're sort of entering either water top of mind or as an organization, you have kind of a mission you're working on. Like, how do you balance that working in community who are facing many, many different challenges at the same time?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I want to say the days of superficial listening are over. It does more harm to send one survey and say A or B, and like put on your website like we've listened with community and we've worked with community. That's not authentic. I think it happens through relationships. It happens through trust. And the only way to build that is long-term, year-round, multi-touch point engagements with community members, with their families, with people that they work with, being in and around the spaces that they're in. And the only way to build trust is through that. So,
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I would love to open it up to the audience to see if folks have questions they'd like to ask the panel. I think we have about 15 minutes. And so if folks have questions.
I'll need a show of hands. Anyone? Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll get it. Okay.
Thank you all for the wonderful discussion. My question is to Dennis regarding the study that was done with the oyster mushrooms and how they are effective as any traditional solution, and letting the city of LA know. Has that report been published for other cities to use for their similar issues with industrial pollution?
Yes. So there's research. I shouted out two people, Danielle Stevenson and Dr. Sam Ying from UC Riverside Department of Biogeochemistry, and they do have publicly accessible public research. And if you can't find it online, just find me afterward, and I'm happy to share those details with you.
Excellent. Additional questions? There we go. This may take a while.
Get your steps in.
Thank you so much to all of you for the wonderful work you do and for speaking for sure from your hearts and experiences. You touched a little bit upon this already, but specifically I would like to know more examples, because we as environmental justice communities, as environmental justice leaders, we know our communities struggle with prioritizing so many things. And sometimes, it's very hard to think how really we're going to be prioritizing right now, thinking about to put a levee or a wall for climate solutions when I don't have money to bring it to my table and with there's public safety issues. So how do you engage them in thinking, the river restoration, we have noticed that in our community, that we call them for listening circles about climate resilience, and we end up talking about public safety, or we're the topic, whatever is relevant to community. So how do you make sure that we're meeting community, that where they are at, but how do you help as a collective, I guess, bring them to thinking about all these important water equity issues? Voy a decirlo en español para hacerlo más inclusivo rapidito. Quería saber si en todas las prioridades que hay en la comunidad, y como siempre tienen nuestras propias comunidades tanto que lidiar con la injusticia, entonces cómo priorizan y cómo ayudan a priorizar sabiendo que todos están pues tratando de tener unas metas juntas colectivas, pero que no se puede hablar a veces de la injusticia del agua, porque tienen otras prioridades como la salud pública, como inmigración, salud en general. Entonces, ¿cómo les ayudan a centrar su voz?
First of all, it's hard. So you're definitely not alone. I really appreciate the question. I think what we try to do, and we're certainly not always successful, but what we try to do is have long and deep relationships with many types of groups around an issue. And in that way, when we get to a meeting and the real topic of the evening is public safety, we can rely on our partner who knows more about public safety to help us with that conversation, but also help maybe to bridge that conversation with water, if not at that meeting, maybe down the road, to make sure that, because of course public safety and an important levy do have relationships. We've seen that with We the People of Detroit as an example. We work with a group called Wisdom Institute together with reproductive rights. We have unions. We have all kinds of groups that we meet with on a regular basis, and they're part of our collaborative. So when we're in community and having those conversations, it's more likely there's someone who can help us navigate that and figure out, is it the time now for this issue to be at this table, or is it maybe in the future? So.
I'll add, can you hear me or no? I'll add also similarly, one thing that's really important for us, because we've grown in recent years. When I started, we were a 3-person staff. We're now 11, I believe. And so we've grown to really respond to the demand of the work. And I'm proud to lead that growth. We still are overwhelmed in what is needed to, like, how all the work that needs to happen. So I think that one thing is to be really clear on what we cannot do, and to start conversations with, like, we will do boundary setting. That as part of this work, we want to prioritize, we want to have some priorities, but we also are not able to do all the things. Bayou City Waterkeeper works in this very, as a sort of liaison. We are in dialogue and in coalitions that are more conservation green organizations, and that really is kind of informed by, like, a lot of our wetland work. And then we also are in dialogue with a lot of more justice-oriented organizations. I believe that we are in that in-between space, and we want those conservation organizations to think more about justice. We want the justice organizations to think about centering green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. We play that sort of a connecting role, and I think that's a really critical role, to think about what spaces that we're in, and being clear what we cannot do, and then going to some of our partners to say, we can't prioritize this work, but can you prioritize this work? And I think we also work, as I mentioned earlier, in this highly collaborative, cross-disciplinary way. When I first started the organization, I did, that was one of the things that I tried to sort of reclaim. It seems kind of messy, where it's like, oh my gosh, you guys do all these things. But actually I said, no, that's strategic and that's intentional, that we purposely work collaborative across disciplines, using science, using law, and we work with conservation and justice-oriented organizations, because the water that we serve, we have to work in this sort of a way. But being clear on what we cannot do. I wanted to share one final example, too, that I did mention earlier, is a unique way that we work around, in terms of, like, how you're saying, how can we work in this sort of, like, unique way, is we do One Water work, and we actually have a project that's funded by Pisces and through Mitchell Foundation. The city of Houston is doing a One Water plan, and so the question is how to center community. And so an innovative way in showing up in that is to bring conservation partners, conservation leaders, and environmental justice leaders together. And Bayou City Waterkeeper work with National Wildlife Federation to convene these two groups. I think what I'm trying to make sure that community members are centered as part of the One Water process. They're sort of liaisons to larger community members. What I'm trying to share is that how we work has to change, especially with our limited capacity. We can only do so much. I've said that before. We're exhausted. Yeah. And some of us are exhausted in different ways, especially leaders of color. So we have to think innovatively around our capacity limits because we have so much pressure. Pressure from funders, pressure from community, pressure from decision makers. We're exhausted. So how can we work in new ways and innovative ways to really kind of move our missions forward in community and serve community?
Yeah.
One back here.
One in the back, and then we'll come up front.
Thank you. I have a question that anyone can answer, but Ayanna, you talked about working with academic institutions to make data available for communities. What kind of data are you collecting just to understand how helpful it will be for communities? And also, I'm not sure you work with all of the municipalities and all the counties in Texas. There are probably other places that don't have that kind of access. Do you see this as something that could potentially be housed in some capacity at the state level so that all communities are able to access that data to make those decisions?
Well, yeah, I'll just say that Houston is big and Texas is huge. And we are, going back to what we cannot do, I'm really clear is that our focus is really around the Houston region, which is so big. And so in our strategic plan, one of the things that we said is we will work strategically with university partners to build community power around data gaps, and then also to inform decision makers, because there's so many data gaps with decision makers. What we've done in the past 2 to 3 years is forge partnerships with Texas Southern University, with Rice University, with Stanford, and then that's all in service towards community. An example of that is we're working with Stanford around our wetland work. We do a lot of work around in upstream communities around wetland protection. A big missing data gap piece is how does the loss of wetlands upstream impact BIPOC communities downstream through flooding. So what data gaps do they need to better advocate for flood protection on a policy level? And so we're doing that work is under development. And then beyond that, we've launched all kinds of maps around sewage, we've mapped 5 critical wetland areas that we have to protect these areas. If we don't protect them, it's a really critical issue. So we've done visualizations and maps in dialogue with universities, and those are some concrete examples. And just really rooting it in Houston, because Texas is already a thing, you know? It's important to really be super local. If we can figure out Houston, then other cities can learn from us. But our area is Houston.
Dennis, do you want to respond on the working with universities on data?
Yeah. In terms of community science, I think it's really important to work with community members to allow them to see themselves as individuals that can contribute to the bigger picture. I think that's a really important element of it. A lot of the students that I've worked with, I think when we started this project, they were just like, I can't do this. I can't do this research. And there was a barrier, and that was an internal barrier that they thought like, I wasn't able to do this. But that's also a product of a lot of systemic problems, why they see themselves as a person that can't contribute to the overall scientific picture. So I think that's one piece of it is encouraging community members and youth especially to see themselves as a really critical tool to connect to the bigger picture of community science and that data that can be leveraged to influence policy.
And I think similar to that, what you're saying, Dennis, the Flint Community Lab, I think we heard a little bit about that yesterday, and they're doing such amazing work to bring youth to get job training, to understand what it's like to be a chemist. They don't have to be a chemist, but they get to watch the chemist, and they get to participate in the process of the analysis. They get to learn what it is to go out and collect water samples in the community and then be able to deliver that data out to the community member who wants to know what's in their water. So I think that's the other side of that, is that communities, I think, often want to do this. They want, and so with a little bit of help with the university or other sponsor, they're really able to do it amazingly. We don't need to be there. You know, the lab is completely doing this great work, and it's all done by youth and adults from Flint, which is amazing, and creating maps of where's the lead. So really cool stuff.
There's a question here. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Ayanna, you talked earlier about policy being imaginative and creative. And I'm like, well, what does that process look like? What could it look like? Because when you initially get involved, it can be intimidating. And we're understanding that we have to work in community with people who are being impacted. Even understanding, comprehending what the policy, the language sometimes is even a barrier. So when you're like creating, I'm just wondering, what does that process look like in helping us to imagine and create and just approaching it differently?
Yeah. Can you all hear me? I don't know why I keep turning this off. So I think we forget, I think about, I visited a family member in prison a couple of years ago, and I said, why am I here? And I realized there was policy, and I think about friends that also we've impacted from incarceration. This is non-water, but whatever. It's all connected when it comes to like injustices. I said, why am I here? And I realized there was policy that was written previously to say that what this person did was unjust, and it was because of marijuana. And I think about all the late 40-year-old men, black men that I know that were impacted in the early 50s, that were impacted around those policies that were written decades ago. So someone that was created and written, and that was, before that was written, we had to say that we had to conceive of an idea and said that this was unjust, this was right, this belongs in this doesn't belong in this. So how do we think about that from a water perspective? And I think that one of the things is I have a staff member, and I purposely named her, our title is Organizing and Cultural Strategies Manager. I knew I needed an organizing lead, but I wanted culture to be a part of her work. She is an artist and she's an organizer. So part of this work is to think about the space for culture in an organizing space. Many organizing frameworks already center culture, and I think the water space could do that in a better way, and weaving in what is our connection to our water, and then what do we want, what does the water need? Thinking about sort of indigenous frameworks, number one, what does the water need? Not just what do we expect of the water and what do we need? What does the water need? What does our community need? And then let's step back and not just think about all the impacts that we've experienced, although that will come into this dialogue. What do we imagine in, from a transformative lens? Like, what do we imagine for how do we do collective visioning? That could be some drawing, that could be some visualizations, like doing mapping to see where does the water go. Currently, we don't even know, many folks don't know the source of their water, where it impacts, what a watershed is. And so how do we step back before we get into action and policy, and do that not only with community, but decision makers too. There's so much lack of water literacy that decision makers even have. And so I think the question is, if we think about collective visioning, visualizations to better see what water is, because it's quite abstract for so many people because of so many disconnections that we have, then I think that policy can be built on that, that there's actually space to like visualize and see what the water is, what the water needs. And us, we just had an event called Tributary where we actually go on the water. We bring communities that are impacted, where we're kayaking and in pontoons, and like we just connect to the water. It's the one thing that we do that's not advocacy and policy, where we actually connect to the water. So I feel like restoring these connections, and that can happen through visualizations, creative things. That is actually a part of policy work. And it has to happen not only in community, but with decision makers too.
Well, we have about 2 minutes, and so what I would love to do is just ask each of you one final question, and maybe it's sort of a sentence or something that you want to share. And I'm curious if you can answer what do you need to be more effective in your work? And Jill, I'll start with you. One sentence.
One sentence. I think the biggest thing for us right now is we've seen shifts over the past, say, 10 years of communities being able to access more resources, in some cases more funding, more things that they needed to do the local work. I think what we need now is kind of the next step of that evolution of also creating more space to make sure that those local leaders are centered in our policy conversations at all levels. And I see that coming, but I think that's one really important next step in this evolution to really working effectively in community. Thanks.
I think progress has been made with recent policies around EJA. Didn't talk much about the, EJA and the bipartisan infrastructure law and Justice 40. I think we sort of just have to acknowledge that there's progress that's being made. We're talking about disadvantaged communities. I think that we have to see where community is on the ground. That there's a, and so looking at frameworks like community science that are happen in so many more and more organizations, the space for movement and community lawyering that is happening more and more, the lawyers side by side with the organizers. What is happening, the space for creativity and creative imagining and regeneration and water recreation with hard-hit communities, for us to go deep on the ground and to see what is happening on the ground with all the changes that have happened with like recent policies, and to see the new frameworks and to inform policy from these new frameworks that are emerging and developing and shifting.
My message is to the folks on the ground, to specifically the people of color on the ground and the queer people of color on the ground. You have permission to rest. It is so important to take care of yourselves and heal, and you are the ones with the power to influence our systems. So take care of yourselves because that is what we need.
Thank you, and one more round of applause for our incredible panelists.
This is wonderful. Yes. I think it was lovely curated.
All right, let's give one more round of applause to our awesome panel. Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you. Okay, so field trips are next. So please be at the designated spot for your field trip by no later than 2 p.m. And then at the party tonight, please don't forget to bring your ID, your pint cup, and your meal tickets, and maybe a jacket as well, because we're going to be doing a lot of dancing and celebrating and having a good time. And I really can't wait to see you all there later. So have a great afternoon, and we'll see you tonight.